Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Welcome to another fabulous edition of Ask That. My name is Clark Sell, and today we're going to dive into learning. And with me today, I have Ken Sodemann. Ken, how are you, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you today?
I'm doing well. The sun is out, and
Oh, yes.
that's a nice thing.
Yeah, especially with, I mean, April's been like colder than March for
Right.
some reason, but I don't know
Yes.
why.
It's the fabulous month where it snows and we mow snow. So just kind of getting ready for construction season, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
So before we dive into continuous learning and health and everything around that, why don't you give everybody a quick introduction of who you are?
Okay. Well, my name's like you already said, Ken Sodemann. I live in right outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Currently I work for Ionic, which some of you probably have heard of already.
Yep.
Been working there about 6 months, and before that, I worked at a company in Brookfield that made ERP systems for large construction companies, and
Okay.
I worked there for about 18 years.
Wow.
Um,
That's quite the
Prior to
switch.
that, I worked on avionic systems
Oh,
prior
nice.
to that in
In
college. So
in avionics, was it the electrical side of things or the software side of things?
it was the software side of things. I started out in verification and then moved into some development
Nice.
while I was there.
Nice,
Worked
nice.
with most Rockwell, Honeywell stuff, companies like that.
Small craft, big craft.
The first aircraft I worked on was a 777, Boeing
Really?
777. But I've also worked on some smaller military planes. The smallest, probably the C-12 transport. I think that holds like 10 people or so. So
Little smaller than the 777.
yeah, just a tad.
So you and I were talking earlier today, and you said you wanted to talk about continuous learning. And I think as developers in this space, I know that I work in the web space mostly. Uh, it feels like a never-ending cycle of change every day, which there certainly can get difficult at times. And as I've gotten older in my career, I think I've also spent a lot of time trying to better my mental state and just how to interact with others. So learning's not just yet another book, but or yet another library, but the kind of bigger me in the picture of that. How do you think of continuous learning?
Um, I basically think of it as a necessity. I mean, especially in this particular industry. Um, I wouldn't be at Ionic right now if didn't myself pick up and learn other things that were not part of my day to day part of my day to day job and operations where I was at.
Sure.
Um, you know, the when I first started at Penta Technologies, which was the prior place, I was hired to do server side Linux and well, at the time it was actually HPUX, later became Linux, but Linux and Oracle development. And I did some UI stuff that was all for VT220s. This all real old server
Yep.
technology. I mean, it was 1999. So,
Yep.
um, and as time progressed, they had, decided they wanted to move into uh, doing things for web and mobile technologies, and they needed people to do that. And it was either hire out new developers and replace who's there, or you got to learn the stuff that they need done. And if you are, if you're not the type of person who's going to sit down and actually dive into things and learn on your own, you are going to eventually be left behind. And, that's unfortunate, but it's reality in this particular industry. Um, it's, I don't know. I mean, it's just, I think people who get into computer science, though, have a natural curiosity and do want to learn things and do want to know how things work. So just continuous learning seems to be something that comes natural to a lot of us anyways. There's multiple ways that I approach it. Part of it, I was trying to drive through like this 10% thing over at Penta, where people spend like 10% of their time on education. I didn't quite get that through, but one thing that I did manage to get through was getting them to get every developer there a Pluralsight license, so they could work on their own, and that actually turned out to be really successful and very beneficial to the company itself, because the things that people managed to learn and pick up there, even though it was on their own time, were directly applicable to the direction that the company wanted to go. So it was kind of a win-win situation on both sides. We didn't have to pay for the Pluralsight licenses ourselves, but the company got, some valuable advancement out of that. You mentioned side projects. I almost always have a side project or two going, just so I can learn new or different things. When I was at Penta, I used to do a lot of stuff with Angular and with Ionic and et cetera. And that actually led into us using those technologies within, for projects that were there within their software system. And now I tend to focus on other things that I'm not necessarily doing day to day in work. I've been working a little bit with Vue. I've been working a little bit with doing actual iOS native development, which I've never done before. And just because, it'll be helpful in my job. A lot of my job is helping people to build hybrid native applications. And, I've never developed an actual native application before. And a lot of these people are coming from backgrounds where they have developed native applications and are trying to move more into the web technologies. So it just helps us to be able to have, some sort of common ground in that area. Right. Yeah. You can take things that you've learned in other related disciplines and apply them to, what you're doing right then and right there. I was just interviewing a guy yesterday for a job. And he got into development. He started at a company doing, customer support. He was just like the frontline customer support guy. People, call, some of it was phone, some of it was, ticketing systems on the internet. Basically, it was just handling these frontline tickets. He knew nothing about development, but he knew stuff about technology. And so he'd help them through their issues and then, basically triaging things. And then if it was a software bug type issue, then he'd hand it off to the developers. But through that, he got interested in, he's like, well, how does this app that I'm, triaging the problems for actually work? And then he started digging into things. And then he started, then he took a course in iOS development. And eventually they offered him a job as a developer because, he showed that initiative, had that curiosity, had that drive. And, I'm interviewing him for a job. He doesn't have the experience, the exact experience that we're looking for, because he's never really done any web development. He doesn't know TypeScript. He hasn't used Ionic. He's never used Angular, all these things that are very basic, fundamental to Ionic itself. But he has that drive and he has that curiosity. And in my opinion, that's way more important than any specific knowledge you may have at this point in time, because that stuff you can learn. But actually having that drive and that curiosity, that's not something you learn. That's either something you have or you don't have. With him, it was just really obvious. What's that? A lot of it's intuition. You can kind of tell by how they act if they really do have that drive or not. I think um, a lot of times, because if they really do have that drive, they're really excited about talking about the things they've done, and they're really excited about talking about this side project that they're doing, or they're really, there's just a level of excitement that you can feel there within how they talk about things. So that's actually really hard because I think a lot of us as developers are ooh shiny object, and then um, and we have a tendency to dig into the first 85%, then the 15% that gets hard, and then we're like see another shiny object and go to the 85% there. I do have an awful lot of projects that are basically half done. Yeah, just like everybody else. Yeah, but part of that was, well, yeah, I was only doing that project to learn anyways. It wasn't like this was actually going to be something that was useful. But some of it is just setting aside dedicated time and then doing it. Some of that's easier than others. A non-computer related learning exercise I have. I'm a horrible mechanic, but my dad literally builds cars from the ground up. So him and I are building a 32 Ford Roadster together, and it's almost done. Um, and we started with rebuilding a Chevy 350 to put in it. That's how it all started. So he taught me, how to rebuild this engine and how to put things together. And staying focused on that was just basically, there's set aside time where I go over to my dad's house and I help him work out in the shop on that car. Even if I don't feel like it that day, I go over, it's a little bit easier. Um, I'm 50. He's in his early 70s. It's great to spend time with your dad, and he's not going to be around forever. And, so you have that motivation as well. But there's also just that whole learning factor there. I'm learning stuff that I knew nothing about. Um, you know, yeah, there's a lot of that. A lot of this is not, like a Lego set where you have instructions and you're just putting pieces together. A lot of this you have to figure out how we're going to get this piece to align with this piece and how we're going to route the steering, how we're going to route the brake lines, how we're going to get everything, set up properly. And, there's no real instruction manual. There's a lot of trying to figure things out. And, a lot of that, it's a lot of the same logical steps that you have to do in order to build anything, whether it's physical or logical. Oh, yeah, that's horrible. Right. I should just continue doing this. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my current job is I'm an enterprise support engineer, which means I spend a lot of time talking to enterprise customers that are using Ionic in order to build applications, and I spend a lot of time helping them to better utilize the framework and better utilize some of our offerings in order to solve their own problems. So I spend a lot of time talking to the customers and seeing what they're doing, feeling what their pain is with the framework or with the products that we have. But I definitely believe that it would be very beneficial to also cycle in people that are actually working on the framework or working on some of these other products and have them directly talk to the customer. Just the amount of stuff that you can learn just talking to somebody else, because I mean when you're developing something you're just thinking about the one way that you would use it, or not all the creative ways that people come up with to use the product. And sometimes those creative ways are are very useful, and sometimes it's like, why are you even doing that? Okay, and but that even educates you on how, okay, I thought people would just naturally try to use it this way, but really there's these other ways that people are thinking, and I need to modify our tutorials or something to steer them down the right direction. There's a lot you can learn. Yeah, yeah, and there's there's a lot you can learn from that as well. I mean, if they're using it in ways you never even thought of, that gives you ideas on how you can improve the product or which ways you can steer the product in order to possibly better facilitate that. And sometimes there's negative consequences. I mean, Facebook opened their whole API so people could use it in creative ways, and then they did the whole Cambridge thing. So. Yeah, right. Yeah, you just got to learn from what happens and deal with it and move forward. Um, that's changed a lot actually over the years, and that's it, in a totally positive way. Um, so back in the 90s, I would spend a lot of time with books. I mean, you'd have to go buy your Borland compiler. You'd get this stack of books that came with it. You'd plow through those books. Then you'd go through and get, some book that was like this thick on triple C++ or whatever. And then you'd run into issues. So you'd post something on CompuServe, blah, blah, blah. That's what you post it on CompuServe, wait 3 days, see if somebody had your answer. Yeah. And that was both good and bad. I mean, it was good because, like you say, it was an authoritative source. Um, now I find what I start with is usually a course like I said, I used to have at my prior when I worked for Penta, I had access to Pluralsight. Now I tend to buy Udemy courses for things that I'm interested in. And what I'll usually do is get about halfway through a course, and I'll get to the point where I'm like, okay, I don't really want to listen to this course anymore. I want to actually go do something. Then I start doing, and then once I start doing, I see where I run into issues where I don't know something or can't figure something out. Then the sources are basically Stack Overflow or going back to the Udemy course if I can find a chapter that had something to do with that. And usually it's a combination of both. So Google and Stack Overflow and a lot of the tools like that have really kind of advanced the ability to actually get out and learn something and get your problems. So that's on the plus side. On the negative side, it's also opened things up to getting bad information because you don't have that authoritative source. Though Stack Overflow mitigates that with their whole voting system and being able to say, hey, this is the solution, and having people that have answered a lot of stuff have more points. There's mitigation to that. And it's also opened up, I see a lot more of basically the copy pasta type. I found this on Google. I'm going to copy this in here. I don't really understand it. I'm just going to, can't count the number of times I've code reviewed something and I've asked, okay, why are you doing this? Well, that's what the guy on Google, when I did a Google search, that's what they said. Oh, okay, yeah, it works, but you don't understand why it's doing that. And that's a big problem because we have to, getting this software out the door is one thing, but then we have this whole maintaining it after it gets out the door thing to worry about. And if you're not understanding what you're copying in, just getting it off of Google, that's a problem. Oh, absolutely, yeah. The thing that I saw it the most with was probably CSS because you have less of you don't have the whole logical flow that you can actually figure. You have to keep in your mind the rankings and the cascading, and it's just hard for people to wrap their brain around and put it all together as to why doing this actually works and how you should structure things. And Yeah. 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 We have like one person at Ionic who just loves doing CSS, and she's really, really, really good at it. I mean, super good at it. But that also means any CSS issue basically gets deferred to her because nobody else wants to deal with it. And I know it well enough to know how to screw up enough to, yeah, yeah, I made the mistake at my prior job of being good at SQL tuning, so I ended up having to do a lot of it, and it was like, oh, this is so painful. Yeah, execution plans, and then we were using Oracle, and every version, you get something in that worked great in Oracle 9, and then Oracle 10 would be slow, and then Oracle 11 would be worse, and it worked in 11, back on 10 and 9. And we had customers on all three of these, so it was just, yeah, it was great. Yeah, but actually, I had been doing web and mobile stuff for like 5 years. That was another one of those things where, well, that was one of those things, one of those continuing education things. They needed somebody to do the web and mobile front end development, and nobody raised their hand. And I said, I'll learn it. I'll do it. So I ended up the chief architect on their web and mobile stuff. And then we hired a team of people who had actually done it, which was also really handy because then they came in and told me I was doing it wrong. So I'm like, yeah, okay, you keep telling me that. This will work out. fiberglass body. The frame, of course, so we built the frame ourselves. And, after my dad retired, he was a mechanical engineer over at Briggs & Stratton. After he retired, he started building frames for 32 roadsters. And he had some steel laying around, and he had the block for the Chevy 350. And it's a Chevy and a Ford. This Ford. And so we rebuilt that. We started working on the frame, and we just started building that car just because he had the parts laying around, and I think something he wanted to do with me is, I mean, he gets older and wants to just pass some of this stuff on. So this car, I believe, 2 years. Yeah, we covered through this one. Before that, we were working on a 60 bug, which that was actually my idea. I'm like, I want an old VW Beetle. So we found one and we started working on it. That one went a lot slower because he's never worked on a Beetle before. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a horrible mechanic. So this was like a complete learning experience for both of us. And it took us like 5 years to get that thing back on the road. But it's a lot of fun. Well, that is the problem. Yeah. But his initial plan was he was just going to tell me what to do on the 32, and then I would have to do it. But I can only come out there on Saturdays. So he actually does a lot of work in between because otherwise this card never get done based on the amount of time I have. Yeah, he's actually retired and does a lot of the work in between. With me to the conference. Yeah, it's a little nerve wracking.